Hello, I'm Hassan Ajami. I'm a Lebanese author and a freelance journalist. I also work at Thunderbird School of Global Management. I teach there Arabic language and Arab Islamic culture. Today, our topic is the Arab Islamic communication and information. But before reaching there, it would be better to introduce Claude Shannon and explain his basic ideas. As you know, Claude Shannon is a great American mathematician, and he's the father of information theory. So it's important to know about him and about his basic ideas. According to Claude Shannon, communication is transmission of information. So he analyzes communication as transmission of information. In this sense, communication is a relationship between a sender and a receiver. The sender will send a message to the receiver, and the receiver will receive the message, analyzes it, interprets it, and in order to obtain information from it. So in this sense, communication is a relationship between a sender and a receiver. Now we ask Claude Shannon, you analyze communication as transmission of information. So you analyze communication in terms of information. What is information? According to Claude Shannon, information is surprise. In other words, information is a measure of probabilities. I will explain this using two examples. Suppose that I'm communicating with you and I'm telling you that the sun will rise tomorrow. This message, the sun will rise tomorrow, is not really informative because you already know that the sun will rise tomorrow. So it doesn't surprise you. Therefore, it is not informative. In this sense, information is surprise. The other example, suppose that I'm communicating with you and I'm telling you that the temperature tomorrow will be precisely 40 degrees Celsius. This message, that the temperature tomorrow will be precisely 40 degrees Celsius, is informative. Why? Because it does surprise you. This message surprises us because usually we aren't able to precisely predict the temperature tomorrow. So in this sense, information is surprise. Also, what's interesting about Claude Shannon's idea is that he has a relationship, an inverse relationship, between information and the probability of the occurrence of the message. And his basic claim is the following. Whenever the probability of the occurrence of the message is low, is minimum, therefore the information is maximum. So this is how his relation goes, the relation between the information and the measure of probabilities. For example, as you mentioned, concerning the example of the temperature, the probability of the occurrence of the message that the temperature tomorrow will be precisely 40 degrees Celsius, the probability of the occurrence of this message is low because usually we aren't able to precisely predict the temperature tomorrow. And therefore, the information within this message is maximum. These basic ideas developed by Claude Shannon could be captured and expressed by a single equation. And the equation is the following. Information is equal to surprise over the probability of the occurrence of the message. Now we move to the equation. As we mentioned, the basic ideas of Claude Shannon could be captured in this equation. Information is equal to surprise over the probability of the occurrence of the message. So mathematically, when the surprise is maximum, while the probability of the occurrence of the message is minimum, it mathematically follows that the information is maximum. As we have seen in the example, which is that the temperature tomorrow will be precisely 40 degrees Celsius, this message surprises us. It has the maximum surprise, and the probability of its occurrence is minimum. Why? Because usually we aren't able to predict precisely the temperature tomorrow, so it surprises us. And the probability of its occurrence is minimum because usually we aren't able to precisely predict the temperature tomorrow. And therefore, it mathematically follows that the information within that message is maximum. So this equation, in fact, captures and expresses the basic ideas of Claude Shannon, that information is surprise and that there is an inverse relationship between the information and the probability of the occurrence of the message. When the probability of the occurrence of the message is low, is minimum, therefore mathematically it follows that the information is maximum, as Claude Shannon said. Of course, this is just a representation of his basic ideas. What's interesting now is that this equation applies to the West. In the West, information is equal to surprise over the probability of the occurrence of the message. But let's compare it to the Arab Islamic culture. In the Arab Islamic culture, we have information is equal to the probability of the occurrence of the message over surprise. So in the Arab Islamic culture, information is the opposite of the information in the West. In the West, information is equal to surprise over the probability of the occurrence of the message, but in the Arab Islamic culture, we have a different and opposite equation, which is that information is equal to the probability of the occurrence of the message over surprise. Of course, PM here stands for the probability of the occurrence of the message. Of course, what's going on here is that we are analyzing communication. There are different communication patterns in the West, and also there are different communication patterns in the Arab Islamic culture. But now we are concentrating only on one communication pattern. And the communication pattern that we are concentrating on in the West is the following. Communication in the West is transmission of information, such that information is surprise over the probability of the occurrence of the message. But the communication in the Arab Islamic culture is totally different. In the Arab Islamic culture, communication is transmission of information such that information is equal to the probability of the occurrence of the message over surprise. So we have totally two different communication patterns. So let's move on to the Arab Islamic culture and see how this formula works. As you see, it is a mathematical formula. When the probability of the message, when the probability of the occurrence of the message is maximum, while the surprise is minimum, it follows mathematically that information is maximum in the Arab Islamic culture, which totally contradicts the information in the West. This is what's important. Now let's see how this equation of communication and information works in the Arab Islamic culture. I will have two examples. The first example is ahlan. Ahlan means welcome. So we always say ahlan to each other in the Arab world because it means welcome. So the probability of the occurrence of the message ahlan is maximum. And the surprise is minimum because we always say ahlan to each other. Therefore, it mathematically follows that the information within ahlan itself is maximum. And in fact, it is a fact that the information within ahlan is maximum. So this equation explains the fact why the information within ahlan, which means welcome, is maximum. Let's now explain how ahlan contains a huge amount of information, as this equation predicts and explains. Ahlan means welcome, but ahlan comes from ahl. Ahl means family. So when I'm telling you ahlan, I'm telling you welcome. At the same time, I'm telling you that you are part of my family. And which implies also that the family values should control our relationship and ultimately control the society. So there is a huge amount of information within a single word, which is ahlan. Why? Because of this equation. So Arabs and Muslims tend to follow this equation. They communicate in this sense, and information is exactly this, and they act and think in light of this equation. Another example is Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum literally means peace be upon you. It's a greeting. Most Muslims say Assalamu alaikum to each other always, on a daily basis, of course, because it's just it's a greeting. So most Muslims say Assalamu alaikum to each other. Therefore, the probability of the occurrence of the message, which is Assalamu alaikum, is maximum, while the surprise is minimum, because I will not be surprised if you tell me Assalamu alaikum. And therefore, mathematically, it follows according to this equation that information is maximum in Assalamu alaikum. And in fact, information is maximum in Assalamu alaikum. Therefore, this equation explains why information is maximum in Assalamu alaikum. Therefore, this equation has an explanatory power. Therefore, it is plausible. It's plausible that it is controlling the Arab Islamic culture today. Now let's explain how Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you, has maximum information. In fact, Assalamu alaikum is an Islamic greeting. We have in Arabic marhaba. Marhaba means hello. It is religiously neutral, marhaba. So Arab Christians use it. But Assalamu alaikum is an Islamic greeting. Therefore, when I tell you Assalamu alaikum, I'm telling you, first of all, peace be upon you. I'm greeting you, and I'm telling you that peace be upon you. At the same time, I'm probably identifying myself as a Muslim. And I'm telling you, you should perceive me as a Muslim. And you should treat me as a Muslim. And Islam should control the relationship between us. And ultimately, Islam should control the society itself. So there is a huge theology and ideology within saying Assalamu alaikum. That's why Assalamu alaikum has maximum information. And it contains maximum information because of this equation. Because the probability of its occurrence is maximum. Always the Muslims are saying it. And we are not surprised by it. So the surprise is minimum. Therefore, the information within it is maximum, as this equation explains. Of course, here the examples are many. We'll just use these two examples to see how this equation is controlling the behavior and the thought of the Arabs and Muslims. Let's move on now to another topic related to these two equations. Suppose, for example, that we have a major event in the West, such as an earthquake, God forbid. When we have a major event such as an earthquake, we expect that the information would be maximum. So let's see how this equation in the West works. When we have a major event such as an earthquake, then the surprise is maximum because we're not having earthquakes every day. And the probability of the occurrence of the message that there is an earthquake is minimum because we're not also having earthquakes every day. So mathematically it follows that the information is maximum. Therefore this equation in the West explains why if we have a major event such as an earthquake, God forbid, then we have maximum information. So this equation has an explanatory power, and therefore it explains important phenomena. Therefore it is plausible. Let's move now to the Arab Islamic culture, and we suppose the same thing. Suppose that we have a major event such as an earthquake in the Arab Islamic culture, also God forbid. Here, what's going on is the opposite of what's going on in the West. According to the Arab Islamic culture, the probability of the occurrence of the message that there is a major event such as an earthquake is maximum. Why? Because today, and for centuries now, there is a specific theology controlling the Arab Islamic culture. According to this theology, Islamic theology, everything is predetermined by God from eternity. Therefore, the earthquake itself is predetermined by God from eternity, and the message that there is an earthquake is predetermined by God from eternity. Therefore, the probability of the occurrence of the message that there is an earthquake is maximum, because it's predetermined by God from eternity. And the surprise would be either moderate or minimum. Why? Because the Arab Islamic mind would reason in the following way. It would say to itself that, the Arab Islamic mind would say to itself that, since everything is predetermined by God from eternity, therefore the Arab Islamic mind shouldn't be surprised by the occurrence of the earthquake. Therefore, the surprise would be either moderate or really minimum. In this sense, here we have a major event, but the probability of the occurrence of the message that there is an earthquake is maximum, while the surprise is either moderate or minimum, and therefore, according to this equation, information is maximum. So also this equation captures the fact that if we have a major event, such as an earthquake, then the information is maximum. This shows that these two equations have explanatory power and therefore they are plausible. In the West, people tend to act and think in light of this equation, while in the Arab Islamic culture, people tend to think and act in light of this equation. And this is the basic difference between, or one basic difference between the Arab Islamic culture and the Western culture. Of course, these two equations are relevant to very important topics. Hopefully, we will have another brief session explaining the relevance of these two equations to other important topics. But we can mention also another point at the end, which is the following. As we know, the Arab Islamic culture is a traditional culture. Traditions prevail in the Arab Islamic culture. But why? In fact, this equation, which controls the Arab Islamic culture, explains why the Arab Islamic culture is traditional. As we know, traditions were established in the past, and there are no new ideas and behavior in traditions. Therefore, a tradition or any tradition doesn't surprise us. The surprise is minimum in any tradition, and therefore the information is maximum in the tradition. And our aim is always to maintain maximum information. Therefore, this equation itself leads to and causes the Arab Islamic culture to be a traditional culture. Because in the Arab Islamic culture, our aim is to maintain minimum surprise. And traditions maintain minimum surprise. Therefore, information would be maximum. And that's why the Arab Islamic culture is traditional. Thank you for listening.